Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into two really intense stories. They seem worlds apart at first glance, but both revolve around these incredibly deep female bonds.
Exactly. On one hand, you've got this quite shocking murder case from 1950s New Zealand, Parker-Hulme. Two teenage girls involved in a crime that just, well, stunned the country.
Right, a story that still fascinates. And then, completely different context. We're heading over to pre-war Japan. We're going to explore something called S-culture.
Yes, this really unique phenomenon, these passionate, sometimes romantic friendships between young women, especially schoolgirls, often expressed through literature.
So quite different outcomes, clearly.
Hugely different.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting, I think, is how both cases really shine a light on the sheer power, maybe the all-consuming nature of these bonds, and also how society reacts when relationships don't fit the standard mold.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've gathered quite a bit of material. We've got factual accounts, trial details from the Parker-Hulme case.
And then detailed studies on Japan's S-culture, including the work of Nobuko Yoshiya, this really key author who wrote the Flower Tales series.
Yeah, she was pivotal. So our aim today is to really pull out the key insights, help you understand the dynamics within these relationships, how society saw them, and maybe find some surprising links between these two very different narratives.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's kick things off with the Parker-Hulme case. It's pretty chilling. So Christchurch, New Zealand, June 22nd, 1954.
Right. The key figures, Pauline Parker, who was 16, and her friend Juliet Hulme, just 15. And the victim was Pauline's own mother, Honorah Mary Rieper.
And like you said, it kind of faded for a while, but then Peter Jackson's film Heavenly Creatures in '94 really brought it back, didn't it?
It definitely did. Made it infamous for a whole new generation.
So tell us a bit about the girls themselves. Their backgrounds were quite different.
Yeah, very much so. Pauline Parker, she came from a working class background. Her parents worked part-time for the university, house staff, gardeners. And something that came out at the trial, quite significant at the time, was that her parents weren't actually married.
Which wasn't common knowledge then.
Not at all. Juliet Hulme, on the other hand, well, her father was Dr. Henry Hulme, a physicist who actually became the rector of the University of Canterbury, so quite a status difference.
But they ended up at the same school, Christchurch Girls High School.
They did. And their initial bond, interestingly, seems to have formed over shared experiences with illness in childhood. Parker had osteomyelitis, and Hulme had suffered from tuberculosis.
So that shared vulnerability, maybe?
Perhaps. But what happened next is where it gets really intense. Their friendship just escalated. It evolved into this incredibly rich, elaborate fantasy life.
Right, they were writing together, plays, stories.
Constantly. They created this whole parallel dimension. They called it the fourth world. It was their sort of private version of heaven.
Their own heaven.
Yeah. And they genuinely believed they could, access it during moments of what they called spiritual enlightenment. And Pauline explicitly linked this enlightenment to their friendship.
Wow. So the bond itself was the key.
It seems so. It became incredibly exclusive, so intense that Pauline's parents got really worried. They suspected they might be in a lesbian relationship.
And back then, in the 50s, that was viewed very differently.
Oh, absolutely. It was often treated as, or labeled as, a mental illness. So there was real concern, maybe even fear, from the parents' perspective.
Okay, so the intensity is building. What was the flashpoint? What pushed things towards violence?
Well, in 1954, things started to unravel externally. Juliet's parents separated. Her father had to resign from the university, partly because her mother was having an affair.
A lot of instability suddenly.
Exactly. And the family decided to leave New Zealand, head back to England. But the plan for Juliet was different. She was going to be sent to live with relatives in South Africa. The official reason was for her health, because of the past TB.
But the
timing meant separation from Pauline. And both girls were apparently devastated, completely heartbroken at the thought of being parted.
So they came up with a plan for Pauline to go too.
Yes. They decided Pauline had to go to South Africa with Juliet. But Pauline was absolutely convinced her mother, Honorah, would never, ever allow it. She saw her mother as the obstacle.
The sole obstacle to them staying together.
That seems to be how they framed it in their minds. And this fear, this perceived obstacle, led them down a truly dark path. They started planning to remove that obstacle.
To murder Pauline's mother.
Yes. It's shocking to even say. And their long-term plan after the murder was almost fantastical. They thought they'd go to South Africa together, then somehow make their way to Hollywood or New York.
To become famous writers, work in films.
That was the dream, apparently. publish their stories, break into the movie business. It shows this strange mix of desperation and, well, grandiose fantasy.
So the day itself, June 22nd, 1954, what happened?
They had afternoon tea with Pauline's mother at a kiosk in Victoria Park in Christchurch. Afterward, the three of them walked into a more secluded, wooded area of the park.
And that's where the attack occurred.
Yes. Hulme and Parker used half a brick, which they'd put inside an old stocking, and they bludgeoned Honorah Rieper to death.
It's brutal. And they tried to cover it up initially.
Their first story was that she'd slipped, fallen, hit her head, but it fell apart almost immediately. The police found the weapon nearby, and the injuries, well, they were extensive. Major wounds to her head, neck, face. It was clearly a violent assault.
The trial must have been huge news.
Oh, absolutely sensational. The press coverage was intense. There was constant speculation about their relationship. Were they lesbians? Were they insane? Those were the narratives being pushed.
And the verdict.
They were convicted on August 28, 1954, but because they were minors, under 18, they weren't eligible for the death penalty, which was still in effect then.
So prison instead.
Yes. Each served 5 years. Juliet Hulme was at Mount Eden prison. There's a common story that they were released on condition they never contact each other again.
Is that true?
Well, interestingly, the Secretary for Justice at the time, a man named Sam Barnett, explicitly told journalists later that there was no such condition legally imposed. But maybe it was an informal understanding or just became part of the legend.
Fascinating detail. And the wider reaction. You mentioned society grappling with it.
Yes, and it was swift and quite condemnatory. Within just 4 months, the murder was actually cited in something called the Mazengarb Report.
What was that?
It was a report from a special committee on moral delinquency in children and adolescents, and they literally used the Parker-Hulme case as, quote, strong evidence of moral decline.
Wow. So it immediately became a symbol.
A symbol of moral panic, yes. And the report specifically noted the belief, established at the trial, that the girls were homosexual. That was seen as part of the problem.
So after prison, they effectively disappeared.
For decades, yes. They took on new identities, lived very private lives. It was really heavenly creatures in 1994 that flushed them out, so to speak, forcing their new identities into the open.
What happened to them?
Pauline Parker became Hilary Nathan. She moved to England, lived a quiet life, eventually ran a children's writing school near Stroud in Kent. She also became a devout Roman Catholic.
Did she ever speak about the murder?
Not directly in public, but her sister released a statement for her in 1996. In it, she expressed strong remorse for killing her mother. She said it took her about 5 years after the crime to truly understand what she'd done.
And Juliet Hulme.
She became Anne Perry, and many people might know that name. She moved to Scotland and became a hugely successful author of historical detective novels. Very prolific writer.
Really successful. Yeah.
Very. She also joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints around 1968. Later in life, in 2006, she did comment on the relationship with Pauline Parker. She called it obsessive, definitely, but maintained they were not lesbians.
And she passed away relatively recently.
Yes, in April 2023, at the age of 84. So both lived long lives after those 5 years in prison, but always under the shadow of 1954.
An incredible and incredibly tragic story.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Completely different time, different place. Pre-war Japan. Tell us about this S culture. What does S even stand for?
S is short for sister, but it meant much more than just siblinghood. It referred to these really intense, passionate, often romanticized relationships between girls, usually in school settings. Sometimes it involved students and female teachers too.
And this was like a known thing, a subculture.
Absolutely. By the 1910s, S was apparently a widely understood term, almost like a code word. It even overtook older terms like omome, which means something like lover or beloved.
So it wasn't exactly hidden, but maybe not openly discussed everywhere.
Kind of like that, yes. It flourished within girls' schools and girls' popular culture, especially magazines. And it had its own rituals, almost.
Rituals? Like what?
Well, sources talk about senior students discovering a junior they admired and wanting to form an S bond. There might be an approach through friends, almost like a proposal. And gifts, like exchanging ribbons of specific colors, purple for destiny, red for passion, that kind of thing.
Wow, quite formalized.
In a way, yes. If the junior accepted, she might wear the ribbon in her hair, signaling the bond was formed. But it's important to note, while the language used in the literature and magazine submissions was often about love and deep affection, outward physical intimacy seems to have been limited.
Why was that?
likely due to self-censorship and the social mores of the time. These were girls' magazines, girls' schools. There were lines that weren't typically crossed publicly, even if the emotional intensity was very high.
And you mentioned an author, Nobuko Yoshida. She was important in popularizing this.
Hugely important. Nobuko Yoshida is considered a real pioneer of Japanese girls' fiction, or shoujo shisetsu. And she herself was openly lesbian, living with her female partner for over 50 years, which was quite extraordinary for the time.
So she lived this kind of relationship herself.
Exactly. And her Flower Tale series, or Hana Monogatari, which ran from 1916 to 1924, was massively popular. These stories were instrumental in defining and spreading the ideals of S-culture.
What were the stories like?
They often depicted these very delicate, emotionally charged connections between girls. And interestingly, in her later works, Yoshida started portraying same-sex love not just as a phase, but as something potentially equal to or even superior to heterosexual relationships. She really elevated it.
So this wasn't just a passing phase for everyone involved. When did S-culture really peak?
It seems the high point was around the 1930s. This timing makes sense because it coincided with a major expansion of secondary education for girls in Japan. More girls were going to school, staying longer, graduating.
Creating the environment for these bonds to form.
Precisely. Girls' schools became the incubator for S-culture, and evidence from magazine submissions, letters from readers shows it was really widespread, a common part of the schoolgirl experience for many.
Were there, rules to these relationships? Characteristics?
Yeah, scholars looking back have identified some common features. They were typically one-on-one bonds, very exclusive. The partner was seen as unique, irreplaceable. There was a strong emphasis on mutual growth, helping each other become better people.
Aspirational almost.
Definitely. And aiming for permanence, this idea that the bond would last forever. Absolute acceptance of the other person, a kind of purity, and often this interesting element of mirroring, seeing oneself in the other, identifying strongly, sometimes even dressing alike.
Mirroring. That's interesting.
Yeah, and there were even informal rules, like you generally only had one senior S partner and one sama, or one junior S partner and a mito. It had a structure.
So how did the wider society, like educators or parents, view all this? Were they worried?
It was complicated. There was some concern, especially earlier in the 20th century, when there were tragic cases of female suicide pacts, sometimes involving schoolgirls with intense bonds. This led some to link S relationships with homosexuality, which carried stigma.
So similar concerns to the Parker-Hulme situation in a way.
Similar anxieties about intense female bonds, yes, but the response was often different. Educators, in particular, often tried to differentiate S relationships. They'd frame them as maybe temporary, a spiritual kind of love, or practice for future roles rather than true adult homosexuality.
Why? To protect the schools.
Partly, yes. To avoid direct criticism of the girls' school environment as fostering something deviant. But for the girls inside the culture, it seems S was definitely felt as something much deeper and more significant than just ordinary friendship.
How else have people interpreted S-culture?
Well, there are a couple of main viewpoints. Some scholars see it as a kind of counterculture, a way for girls to carve out a space for strong emotional bonds, maybe even practice a form of equal and free romantic love in a society that was very male-dominated and had strict expectations for women, marriage, family, obedience.
So empowering in a way.
Potentially, yes, a space outside the usual constraints, but another view suggests it might have been subtly encouraged by the system.
Encouraged.
The idea is that fostering this kind of intense, devoted, all-accepting affection between girls could be seen as training them for their future prescribed roles as selfless wives and mothers within the traditional family structure. Learn devotion with your sister now, apply to your husband and children later.
That's a more complex take. Two sides to it.
Definitely. It probably functioned in both ways for different people at different times.
What happened to S-culture after the war? Did it just disappear?
It certainly declined significantly after World War II. The social structure changed, the traditional girls' schools were reorganized, co-education became more common, and Western-style male-female romance became much more normalized and visible in media.
So the conditions that fostered it changed.
Exactly. But it didn't vanish completely. Its influence lingered. There were later reissues of classic S novels like Yoshia's, which led to renewed interest. And you can absolutely trace its legacy into modern Japanese pop culture. Well, scholars point to the modern yuri genre manga, anime, light novels depicting romantic or intensely close relationships between women as having roots in S culture's themes and aesthetics.
Yuri, right.
And even things like modern fashion trends. You mentioned mirroring before. There's something called twin coordination, or futago kyuti in Japan, where best friends deliberately dress identically or similarly. That's seen as echoing the mirroring aspect of historical S bonds.
Fascinating. And you said this wasn't just Japan.
No, not entirely unique. Historians have documented similar phenomena in other cultures, like romantic friendships between women in 19th century Europe and America, or the concept of Boston marriages in the US, two unmarried women, often educated and independent, living together in a long-term, committed, socially recognized partnership.
Right, so these intense female bonds have surfaced in different forms across cultures.
It seems to be a recurring theme, shaped by specific cultural contexts.
Okay, so let's try and weave these two threads together now. We've got the Parker-Hulme case, ending in tragedy and condemnation, and we've got S culture in Japan, complex but finding a cultural niche. What are the big parallels you see?
Well, the most obvious one is just the sheer intensity of the bonds. In both cases, you see this incredibly deep emotional reliance, this exclusivity, this sense of creating a shared world separate from everyone else.
That fourth world idea in Parker-Hulme and the almost ritualized partnerships in S culture.
Exactly. A sense of shared identity, being two against the world, or perhaps two creating their own world.
But the outcomes and societal reactions were just starkly different.
Dramatically so. And that's where the context is everything, isn't it? In 1950s New Zealand, this intense bond, perceived through a lens of potential sexuality and deviance, coupled with other factors, ultimately led to a horrific crime and massive public scandal and pathologizing.
Right. The Mazengarb report seeing it as moral decay.
Whereas in pre-war Japan, similar intensities, while maybe viewed with some caution or subject to censorship, found this outlet. They found a place within literature, within the specific culture of girls' schools. It was contained, perhaps, but also expressed and explored.
That's really where it gets interesting for me, how the internal logic of the relationship interacts with the outside world. Parker and Hulme felt trapped, fearing separation, and lashed out violently.
Yes, the external pressure, the family breakdown, the impending separation, it combined with their internal world and fantasy life in a deadly way.
Whereas in Japan, the S relationships, even within a very restrictive society for women, seem to have fostered this kind of artistic and cultural expression, a space for exploring emotion.
It provided a language, a set of narratives, and accepted within limits practices for navigating those intense feelings. It wasn't necessarily easy, and it had its own complexities and potential downsides, but it was a recognized cultural form, not just an isolated problem.
So, stepping back, what does looking at these two cases together tell us more broadly?
I think it really highlights how societies interpret relationships that don't fit neatly into boxes, especially female relationships that are passionate and exclusive, but aren't necessarily defined by traditional marriage or family roles.
The anxiety that can provoke.
Yes, exactly. The swift condemnation in New Zealand versus the more, let's say, managed or channeled existence of S culture in Japan. They both reveal societal anxieties about female autonomy, about sexuality outside of heterosexual norms, about bonds that seem to challenge the primacy of the family unit.
It shows how the same kind of intense connection can be viewed and treated so differently depending on the time, place, and cultural framework.
Absolutely. The label applied dangerous deviants versus participants in a known sister culture makes a world of difference in the outcome.
So, wrapping things up, what's the main takeaway here? We've journeyed from a really dark crime in New Zealand to this intricate cultural world in Japan.
For me, it underscores the incredible power and, yes, the complexity of human connection, particularly these intense bonds formed often in adolescence or young adulthood between women. They can be life-defining.
And incredibly fragile, or even destructive when put under pressure.
Right. These stories, worlds apart as they are, really force us to think about how much external forces, societal expectations, family pressures, cultural norms shape the path these deep relationships take.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How do we today understand and react to intense friendships or relationships that defy easy labels, especially when they occur outside conventional structures?
That's the big question, I think. What lessons can we draw? We see the potentially devastating results when obsession isn't checked, or when external pressures become unbearable, like in the Parker-Hulme case.
But we also see in S culture how sometimes societies can create spaces, even if imperfect ones, for these powerful emotions to be expressed, explored, maybe even channeled creatively.
It's a spectrum, perhaps, from tragic outcome to complex cultural form.
It really is a lot to think about. That desperate need to stay together driving Parker and Hulme versus the romantic ideals and rituals of S. They both push us to look harder at the lines we draw between friendship, love, obsession, identity.
And how those lines shift depending on who's drawing them and when and where.
Definitely something to mull over. Thanks for exploring that with me.
My pleasure. Fascinating stuff.
Until our next deep dive.